Greetings, peace, and power. I always like to start our presentation with a greetings. Greetings to all our Confederation members, all those who we wish to be Confederation members. Peace to everyone in the Afro-descendant United States and the 240 million Afro-descendants in our hemisphere. And we'll go into that in a minute, because one of the things that we're talking about today is definitions. And we definitely would be at an extreme disadvantage, and we have been for years, by letting the United States define us as a simple minority. Simple minorities always lose. They always have to beg because of the numerical inferior position that they're in. A simple minority always loses to a majority. One of the main reasons why we call this the urgency of this meeting, and I will get into that after the updates. First, we want to cement ourselves as the hardest working people for your vote, for your consent, to be able to proceed to nationhood. We have reached the milestone of 5,000 citizens, and that is a very good accomplishment. However, in order for us to be able to negotiate before the 2020 elections, we are going to increase our numbers to at least 100,000, and we're going to try to move it up to 1 million. This would allow us to have the first block of votes in American history, which would give us, in our history, which would give us the power to be able to negotiate with the Republicans and Democrats. We have no business being a Republican or a Democrat. Both of them are white nationalist parties. And a white nationalist is just not someone who throws up a Hitler sign, is a neo-Nazi, or one of those people. But a white nationalist is simply one who supports and moves things in the interest of the white nation. The simple minority in that equation gets nothing, or gets very little, because this, as it's configured, putting us in that status gives us very little resources. So to move out of that stage, we have gone to a new configuration, and we have upped the ante by adding more lawyers. I'm pleased to report that we're adding more lawyers and more scholars to this effort. We're going to train as many lawyers as possible, because our lawyers presently are working under a ceiling, a domestic ceiling imposed by the Supreme Court and Congress. We cannot get any justice in the Supreme Court and Congress. So we're retraining our attorneys and our lawyers to be able to go into the international courts, into the international forums, and push our case. We have filed a request for decolonization in the UN Decolonization Committee to move us out of this status from a simple minority into an indigenous special minority category. The reason why is because it is worth billions and maybe trillions of dollars to us to be reconfigured to our true identity as indigenous people. And in doing so, what we have done is to bring on some of our best scholars to do that. We are now in negotiations with Dr. Clive Winter and Dr. David Imhotep. Both of them are experts and scholars, and they are also the scholars who prompted us to go through the name change from the African Descendant Nation and the American Institute of Human Rights to putting a Afro-descendant moniker on it. And the reason why is because we are, and I have been informed by, and I am just a lawyer, so I use experts. I do not use my own opinions, especially in cases, in complex cases like this. Even if it was a medical case, you use medical experts. In this case, we use historical anthropologists, forensic anthropologists, DNA experts to be able to inform us as to our identity. And so we're pleased to report that we are now in the final part of our negotiations and bring on two fabulous scholars, Dr. Clyde A. Winters, who is a great scholar and has written a plethora of books, as well as Dr. David Imhotep, The First Africans Were Americans. We have now an understanding for the first time of our identity because we've traced it back through scientific sources, about 80 different evidential categories that cement the fact that we have a series, at least three races running through us: the African race, the Native Americans, which were Native Africans 100,000 years plus prior to the Asian migrations and assimilations and mixtures, which we now has been thoroughly lightened illegally through the one-drop rule of the United States and apartheid state, so that we have indigenous people such as ourselves with our characteristic, with our phenotypical characteristics, looking different than the native people who we created. So in order to reconfigure this, because status means so much. Status is $1 billion, $1 trillion situation when we are able to accept land, when we are acquire land as is our just due. So this is very critical at this point, and this is the reason why we've deemed this almost an emergency, because of the configurations by the economists and the white nationalist think tanks. We are now on the road to zero wealth, which is their fantastic demonical configuration, in which they know that they are becoming a minority in America. So they are really going crazy with the immigration policies to keep the Afro descendants out of the United States, because they know that because of their treatment of us, that we will gain power and we will move them out of the United States. So gerrymandering wasn't enough for them. Redlining was not enough for them. Gentrification was not enough for them. So now they have created and shook us out of household homes. They have shook us out of our neighborhoods. They have taken over the best parts of our communities through gentrification. But we can reverse this, because in international law, they are known as the belligerent occupiers. Let me give you a short power presentation on what kind of situation we're in, and then we're going to talk about how we are going to get out of this situation and why we need you to declare now. Let me start the presentation. Occupation and Beyond. This was put together by one of our UN human rights defenders, UN human rights defender Elena Porter, and we asked her to do this. And what she has and what we have in international law is a situation in which we are belligerently occupied. That's a concept, and keep that, write it down. Belligerent occupation. Belligerent occupation is a definition. It's a definition of a colonial occupant who has occupied territory. We have a belligerent occupant lording over our territory called the United States. Brother asked me, I think he was in the Nation of Islam. He asked me, what was our territory? I told him the entire United States was our territory. And he didn't quite understand that, because in their doctrine, and a lot of our indoctrinations, we think that we just came here in 1619. No, we've been here over 100,000 years, and we have some peer review articles. These are by other scholars that go back into the dating almost, and I'm informed by Dr. David Imhotep, to 230,000 years ago. And these were Africans that occupied this territory not only the United States, but Central America, South America, and all of the Americas. And they go into the explanation and then the evidence of how this occurred. But in international law, our argument is that the United States is a belligerent occupier that is a colonial power. Hence, this is the reason why we filed a request in the UN Human Rights Committee, Decolonization Committee, rather, for decolonization, because this moves us out and reconfigures us out of this simple minority ceiling and really a box of enclosed box that makes us prisoners of war. So belligerent occupation is the concept that we go to next. These are some of the conventions, and this is international law, that deals with the transfer of power from a colonial occupation to indigenous occupation. We need to be in a position to be able to negotiate this with the United States, and this is why we need your declaration. And the United States is trying to head off this by putting another concept or another category or an open category in the sense to make you to declare what you are. And of course, you do not have enough information. And this is the reason why we're going into these explanations as to who you are, because it's been hidden from you that you are the original people, that you made the Indians, that you sailed over here from Africa on the currents way 200,000, maybe 100,000 years plus 200,000 years max. I won't say max because there's always more scientific evidence that uncovers, but during some of the dynasties of the Egyptians, they are right on the Mediterranean. And some of their ships, and they were great shipbuilders, some of their ships out of the Mediterranean, as soon as you get out of the Mediterranean, and I was over there because I lived in Morocco for about almost 2 years, and I know the area very well. In fact, I ferried over from the European continent to Africa by ferry right at the Straits of Gibraltar, and that is the entry point into this current. And currents are like conveyor belts. If you put anything on a current, it comes to the Gulf of Mexico. It comes to the Caribbean. So part of our evidentiary facts, our artifacts, are in those countries to show that we have been here for the period in which we say that we have been here. This is our evidence. The U.S. in 1960. The colonial countries, and this is the law that we filed the decolonization request on, because in this request we say that we are colonial encapsulated people, that we have been here for at least 100,000 years, and that we are an admixture of 4 population waves of Africans. Those Paleo-Americans that first came here in the early days. The second Africans were and those were the Egyptians and some of the Phoenicians. The second wave was those who came out of Mali, and in 1300s. The other waves, the wave that we're most familiar with is the transatlantic wave, which we now recognize was a very small population wave. It was a wave of 388,000 over 200 years, which means only about 1,200 imported Africans, 12 to 1,400 imported Africans came to the United States per year, which leads us to our understanding is that we have made most of our growth as human beings on American soil from the Paleo-American period up and past the transatlantic slave trade up until today, that we have more attachments to the Afro-descendant or Afro-American accoutrements. And they were all African, but they came over different periods. And we are a very unique people, and we have the right to control our resources because now we can prove that we're indigenous people. And this will be our argument in the UN. This would be our arguments and our negotiation points in the United States. This is what we are moving towards. Now, if our arguments prevail, the U.S. is required to withdraw, and this is part of our negotiation, from New York, Chicago, the South, all of our territories. We have a right to govern. This would be the negotiation starting point on how we're going to share governance with the United States, whether it's going to be zones, or the total jurisdiction over these territories. This is called a free association back and forth. Free association is a certain type of government. The free association governments that you see around the world are those that have a relationship with America's colonial past. The Marshall Islands has a free association contract with the United States based upon shared jurisdiction. The Marshall Islands, Samoa, Fiji, Virgin Islands are going through decolonization as we speak. When we veered off, not the direction that Malcolm wanted to do and the Nationalists wanted to do, into civil rights, the Africans and Asians took advantage of this provision on the UN Declaration of Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and People of 1960. Please take that down, get and then look at it, and so you'll see what our legal foundation and our argument is for the territories. And of course, we know we are in an apartheid state. And of course, under Article 3, U.S. Obliges the U.S. government to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate racial segregation and apartheid in its territories under its jurisdiction. And of course, we know that that hasn't been the case. And this is the reason why we think that it's disingenuous for the politicians at this late date to say that they are for reparations, because the Congress is not going to vote for reparations. H.R. 40, which was the in-cobra approach to getting those issues before the United States Congress, has been thrown into a wastebasket known as a committee. Once you propose a bill, it goes into a committee to determine the likelihood of success, the any kind of imperfections, and the way they can reword it so that it's acceptable before it goes to the floor for a vote. It has never done that. It has stayed in this wastebasket of a committee. H.R. 40 has stayed in that wastebasket for nearly 30 years. So it's disingenuous to think that a politician who is now a candidate for president will be able to get it out of that basket before Congress and have the whole House and the Senate vote on it when they have been customary racist. This is not intellectual. Does not make intellectual sense to us. So this is the problem. The framers of the United States Constitution never meant to include Africans and of Native descent and Africans. And the reason why I phrased it like that, because the 1870 Immigration Act referred to us as Africans of African descent, as well as Africans natives. Interesting, because they know that we are the native people of the United States. And it's included, and you can look it up for yourself, in the 1870 Immigration Act, Immigration and Naturalization Act. They call it the Naturalization Act. So it's the 1870, to be precise, it's the 1870 Naturalization Act. These things are necessary. I'm going to show you a short clip on the reason why we have to come out of this condition. This is called the Road to Zero Wealth. The think tank, the white nationalist think tanks, and I'm talking about the Republicans and Democrats. This was not my doing to put this information together. It was this institute that I'm going to show you, and the proponents actually started off with about 5 people from the State Department. So this is really a credible understanding of our present condition. So I'm going to show you the road to zero wealth, and you'll see why our condition is as dire as we portray it to be.
This is the Real News Network, and I'm your host, Jessel Noor. Not only is America's racial wealth gap increasing, if unaddressed, it's actually going to wipe out wealth for communities of color in less than 4 decades. That's the finding of a shocking new report called Road to Zero Wealth: How the Racial Wealth Divide is Hollowing Out America's Middle Class. Now joining us is one of the study's co-authors, Diedrich Asante Mohammed. He's a senior fellow at Prosperity Now, where he heads up the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So you really have to be blind to not see that America has a tremendous racial wealth gap. But talk about how you came to this conclusion that there will be zero wealth in communities of color in 2053 if things aren't addressed.
Well, let me first just comment on your first statement that you have to be blind to not recognize racial wealth inequality, because that is true. Then it's apparent that a good portion of the population is blind. There's been some recent reports from Yale and covered in the New York Times and Washington Post how white Americans feel that African Americans and Latinos are doing much better as it relates to economic equality than they really are. And so that's part of the reason that the report is put forward, is just to help give the true stats and highlight the reality of the great inequality that exists. So in 2013, we have some of the most recent wealth data. White Americans have a median wealth of $117,000. Blacks have a median wealth of $1,700, and Latinos have a median wealth of $2,000. And a big crisis, a big concern is that Black wealth has been going down since 2001. Latino wealth has been going down rapidly with the Great Recession. And that if we look over the last 30 years from 1983 to 2013, we see that there's actually a steady degrade of Black and Latino wealth. And if things keep going from the same way it has been from 1983 to 2013, we see that Black wealth will see a median Black wealth of 0 by 2053, and a median Latino wealth of 0 by 2073. And during those time periods, white wealth will continue to increase, though not quickly, but will continue to increase if things keep going where they have been between 1983 and 2013.
And so your first comment sort of touches upon how this racial wealth gap was created, how much of wealth in middle-class white communities was created through government housing policies that resulted in segregation and advancement for white communities that African American and other communities of color didn't have access to. And that sort of resulted, one of the byproducts of that, or one of the, not even byproducts, one of the intentional results of that is this dramatic segregation we see in our society, so that people don't have insight into how other communities are doing.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of myths out there that lead us to having a wrong understanding of how the world functions. I think most people don't understand that the country hasn't historically always been a predominantly middle-class country. That really arose building off of the New Deal following the Great Depression, and with the development of GI Bill and a very, very strong economy in the late 40s and 50s post World War II. And so, it wasn't until after these programs had been implemented and there was massive investment into a middle class that you see whites becoming majority homeowners for the first time and creating this broad, fairly prosperous middle class, which was a white middle class. Because obviously, when you're having policies in the 40s and 50s, even if at the federal level they didn't say that African Americans or people of color couldn't participate, they were implemented in a very segregationist manner. You had outright racial discrimination in the law, through the 60s. And so we had this massive investment in a time of legal segregation, legal racial disenfranchisement, which meant that the resources, and it's been estimated that more money went into the creation of the American middle class during this time period than went into the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. So we're talking about massive amounts of funds that went to and it was very successful. It created a very strong white middle class. And the challenge today is that as the population of the country increases to include more and more people of color, we're finding that the largest groups in these people of color, Latinos, African Americans, a smaller group, Native Americans, have never attained that financial security, which really is wealth, which allows you to be in the American middle class. And that's where we are today, with great disparities, even among African Americans and whites who are making the same amount of income. We see massive amounts of wealth disparity. One other thing I'll highlight is that even in terms of education, we see that whites with a high school degree make more wealth than blacks with a 4-year college degree. They have more wealth. So again, the disparities go up and down the economic chain for African Americans and Latinos, as well as the educational ladder.
And talk about some of the institutions and factors that continue to drive this increasing racial wealth gap today. We know, obviously, mass incarceration, unequal access to education. There's lots of different systems in play here, but what do you think are the biggest drivers of this?
Sure. Well, I think one thing it's important to note is that the economy over the last 30 years has been much more of a regressive economy. Even for whites, you see a greater concentration of wealth among the top. Part of the challenge is, though, that even low-income whites have more wealth than the median wealth for African Americans. And so even in an aggressive economy, the white middle class is managing to hold on while kind of emerging Black, Latino middle class in terms of income is not finding that wealth stability. So there's an overall regressive economy that's happening. And then, I'll also put forward that, we spend over $650 billion a year in wealth and asset development. And that's a lot of money. And so we would think, well, this should be helping, those who are low wealth attain more of a middle class status. But the challenge with that $650 billion is most of that disproportionately goes to the wealthy. So we are actually investing in further concentration of wealth, and we're investing in maintaining and creating a larger racial wealth divide every year with the numbers of over $650 billion. So we could turn right side up this upside down tax system and make sure that wealth and asset development actually goes to low wealth communities instead of high wealth communities.
So we know that the Trump administration is the wealthiest administration in history. Heading these different, cabinet positions are millionaires and billionaires that have made their fortune sort of plundering the middle class. What you're talking about now. So knowing this, knowing that extracting demands from them are going to be difficult. What should these demands be that people should be organizing around now to address this?
Yeah, well, I think, one important piece I would note is that the Great Recession, allowed for a massive deregulation that kind of took advantage of a middle class that was being left behind, that, people who wanted to become homeowners for the first time and put into mortgages that they couldn't afford, and then were leveraged over and over and over again by Wall Street to make much money off of these loans that were not created to actually sustain themselves. And so, one thing we got to make sure we do is that we don't deregulate again and go back to this kind of predatory economy where Wall Street actually can make a quick buck, but then get bailed out by the government. But the people who lose their homes are just left with massive wealth deficits. So I think that's one important piece. And then again, we'll point to the tax code. I think one thing that was interesting in the last election cycle was that both Trump and Bernie Sanders were talking about the need for raising taxes on the wealthy, and that the American economy has gotten away from this idyllic idea of a strong middle class economy that supported all people. I think a disappointing thing is that when President Trump has gotten into office, his rhetoric is not matching what is being discussed in the White House for reforms in the tax policy. It is looking like it'll just go further down this path, where right now the average millionaire is getting over $160,000 of value off of the current asset development policies, while the working class families only getting $200. So we have to be willing to fight that and actually fight for a much more progressive tax structure to make sure we maintain a strong middle class economy.
And finally, the Trump administration has also set its sights on the estate tax, which tax wealth that is passed down, which is a lot of, which also helps perpetuate this wealth gap. Can you talk about the importance of maintaining or expanding that?
Yeah, the estate tax, I believe sometimes people call it the death tax, conservatives call it the death tax. And, I think it's important to note that it is that, wealth that is transferred from one generation when they pass to the next would be taxed, and they want to cut that. But there's already, I think, a ceiling of none of this is being taxed unless it's over $5 million if it's from a couple. So, that's only the wealthiest of Americans that have over $5 million and then are going to pass it on to the next generation, and then will face this tax. So I think, we have to really be strong in saying, we're not going to worry about taxing the wealthiest Americans who are most benefiting from our society. We're going to actually work to make sure that we still create a society where we have a strong economy, which means we need investments in low wealth communities. And of course, that investment's should disproportionately come from the wealthiest Americans.
All right. Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us, Diedrich Asante Mohammed. The new report is called The Road to Zero Wealth. We'll link to that on our website, therealnews.com. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks again.
Thank you for joining us at The Real News.
Thank you. This was a very good explanation of why our remedy is the correct remedy. And so let me connect the dots between what nationalism does. Nationalism, when we created this nation, and we have a nation of a declaratory nation of 5,000 citizens. When we created this nation, a nation is the most accelerated way to obtain wealth, because a nation has the ability to obtain infrastructure funds. It has a way to continue, especially in our situation here in America, because we're citizens. We're talking about 3 different types of citizenship that our process will give us. It will give us a confederation citizenship. We will retain our American citizenship, and we would have the right to return to our African citizenship if we so desire. This is international law for people who have been colonized and displaced. They have the right to return to the place that they were displaced for, and the people who were colonized have a right to reassert their right over the territory and integrity of their areas, and with an autonomy that is their own. So nationalism is not Black nationalism, and Afro-descendant has transcended into Afro-descendant nationalism. Black nationalism has transcended from putting the power sign up and really being a radical movement to being something that is scientific, necessary, based upon international law, now propelled by international lawyers, human rights defenders, our economists, our professors, and our people now will have a better understanding of why we are reconfiguring and not allowing them to define us and reconfiguring our status. This is the most sophisticated way to do politics, because what is politics? I'm going to tell you what politics is very simply. Politics is who gets what. That's all politics is. When I teach and have taught in the college system as a professor of political science, my background is law. I went to law school, then I further studied international law, and to the extent that now I am an international lawyer. So what putting all of this together, it means that we have the ability to reconfigure ourselves under international law. And this is what we have done. This is the reason why we filed in the UN Decolonization Committee. This is the reason why we are moving to increase our numbers and protect our people, because we are dying in their configuration. They have configured us out of the economic system. Nationalization and the confederation reconfigures us back in. It allows us to have a protected economy, because indigenous people have a protected economy. They have their own government. They have their own schools. They have their own businesses. They control the business licenses, which is the wealth. That's what nationalization does. So when we go into Detroit, and we're going to Detroit with an electoral apparatus to remove the Detroiters out of that very oppressive condition in which they begin evicted from their own city, the land developers are coming in, the gentrifiers are coming in to displace them, they're closing all the schools. This vote reconfigures that, because the vote or the consent allows the people to make the decision, because we can withdraw and replace the government at any time. This is the law. This is American law. This is international law. This is called democracy. So we're using a democratic tool of electoral and putting an electoral apparatus in our majority cities. We have 1,200 majority cities in the United States. We have 45 million people in the Americas. We have the power. We have just been hoodwinked into by the civil rights philosophies and different things to become members of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party are white nationalists. They just voted for a tax cut that does what? Cuts you out of the economy, brings you into a zero citizenship so they can continue to rule you. This is the game that is being played on us, and we will be making our presentations to civil rights organizations, their lawyers. We want to sit down with them. We want to sit down with our best tribes and organizations, so that we can understand that this piece of confederacy, which means that each group can continue doing what they're doing, have their own, the Moors can continue doing what they're doing, the Muslims can continue what they're doing, average everyday Afro-descendant citizens can continue what they're doing, but with a protectorate of nationhood that gives you dignity. Now that we have the police power in our hands in the communities that we democratically now control. This is the wise thing to do. This is the sophisticated thing to do. This is what politics is. This is how they've done what they've done. This is the reason why they want your vote, and we want your vote. They want your vote so that they can maintain power over you. We want your vote so that we can give you power. That's a whole different paradigm. So we are going to go to the Congressional Black Caucus, go to the civil rights organizations, go to our people who are nationalists, Muslims, more, and seek their vote to reconfigure this piece, this existence, because this is not going to wait until 2053, and this is the reason why we have called an emergency summit on this. And we will have a conference on this. We're bringing our best economists in to further explain why this is a must. This nationalization piece is a must. It is a wealth generation protectorate piece. That's what a nation does. A nation appropriates and distributes the funds to the nation. We need funding in our inner cities. We need infrastructure in our inner cities. We need structure in our rural areas, our farming areas. We need a structure that will be able to give us food security, the ability to have police control, the ability to have control over education. This vote would gives us the ability to now have, just with the stroke of your vote, a pen, and allowing us to negotiate. This moves $60 billion to $120 billion into our side almost immediately, with a potential of $1.4 trillion. the Afro descendant is more powerful than they think. In an aggregate, individually, we have no power. The category that they put us in, we have no power. We're in the bag. But with this new configuration, we become powerful. That's why when I began my greetings to you, I greeted you with peace, greetings of peace and power, because the Confederation allows us to move into a peace treaty with all of our organizations and tribes, from civil rights to the nationalists, from the Muslims to the Moors to the Christians. This allows all of us as Afro descendants who have the same common problem now to be able to move together in a parliamentary way to be able to resolve the problems that we have. This is intelligence. It's not intelligence to just vote. That's not intelligence. Our vote has to be aimed, and it has to be aimed for a particular result. This is the intelligent way to do this. I have another a video that I want to show you and prove to you that we were here first, that we have the right to this status, that we have the right to indigenous status, we have a right to do this configuration. This is another one of our very fine scholars. This is Dr. David Imhotep, and he is sitting down in the interview, and he is explaining how, and what I've just related to you, how we have the right as Native people, indigenous people, not as a simple minority. A simple minority is this garbage category that the white folks have put us in, their government, the white nationalists have put us in, so we don't have power. Simple minority always loses. Why? Because he's a minority. Minorities always lose in a majority dominated society. You just don't have the votes. The Congressional Black Caucus are puppets. They don't have the votes, so they become sellouts. They become such extreme sellouts that they have voted to give the police more military equipment to kill us. I'm serious, and I'll be talking about that in upcoming webinars, the 1033 program. They are such sellouts that they have made the police a protected class, and they voted for us, the majority of the Congressional Black Caucus, because they don't have any power, so they have to make these deals to get these pat on the heads to be able to continue. They are pitiful. Our whole approach to politics is pitiful. To be a Democrat, 92% of us voted Democrat. We didn't get a nothing. We didn't get a dime. Politics is who gets what. This configuration, the Confederation configuration, puts billions and perhaps $1.4 trillion into our side. This makes our community turn from what it is now, a poverty-stricken community, to have a community that have state-of-the-art schools, that have a police department under our control, and who is versed in the international standards of policing. Right now, we're being policed as if we are in war zones. In fact, the Israelis are training our police departments just to lord over us, just like they're lording over the Palestinians. No difference with all those weapons. And a breaking down of these weapons when it comes to protests. You've seen what Ferguson was. You know that I'm not lying. You know that every word that I've spoken today, I've spoken not only from the heart, but from the mind. And from an intelligent aspect, that we have the ability to do that, and we must make good choices. This is Dr. David Imhotep, and he's going to explain to you what the school books did not explain to you. The school books had you believing that you came here in 1619. This is when the English came here. The Spanish was here in 1565. We were here. We were the navigators. We showed some of our explorers that was on the Nina Pinta and whatever else that other ship was, Santa Maria, were navigators that have been here. They were Muslim navigators that came here before. This is our land. South America is our land. Central America is our land. Those are now connected to us as Afro descendants. So this is the reason why we went into this change. I didn't do it. And to tell you the truth, this is our view, which can as soon as we put in place the parliamentary government, they can change the name to something else. The names don't mean that much as long as we have the acronyms of a nation. I was telling you, what's the difference between the African Descendant Institute and the Afro Descendant? Just preciseness, but it can be changed democratically. So it's not a big deal. Let's not stop there. Let's not bicker there. Let's not get into this etymological thing about what we're going. No, let's construct a nation and institutions. We can talk about that later. Let's talk about, I'm going to introduce you to, if you haven't already been introduced to you, my good brother, Dr. David Imhotep.
Good things happen when you have an environment of commitment and dedication. Not just talked about, but lived. Lessons of our past, issues of our future.
Okay, we learned a lot in school about 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and all that stuff, but you know what? There were Africans before Columbus, and we've got Dr. David Imhotep to tell us his history lesson that we need to know. Welcome, Dr. Imhotep. And I should say, you have a PhD in ancient African history.
That's correct.
And that's kind of unusual.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. How did you get interested in this area?
It was part of my dissertation led this way, but I could not vary to another subject when my other subject here. So I said, later on, I will write something about that because it's not important in my dissertation at this moment. So that's why I did the book as soon as I finished my dissertation.
Wow, and we should say, and we have a picture of the book too, and it's the first Americans were Africans, and we were talking about Dr. Ivan Van Sertima because I remember back in the 1980s, my dad took me to hear him. He came here to Cincinnati, and his book was They Came Before Columbus, and he talked about you know, how Africans were here. He had a lot of, I mean, great research information, and so it was just kind of eye-opening, but we haven't heard a lot about that recently, so tell us how you got involved here.
Well, I'm showing that Africans not only came before Columbus, they came before the Indians.
So you're going even farther back.
I'm going farther back, at least 56,000 years old.
Okay, now we've got a graphic up here about 130,000 years ago.
Yeah, well, they sailed over here. And when I lecture, people say, well, wait a minute, humans weren't sailing, let alone they weren't boating 130,000 years ago. And I beg to differ. Last year, New York Times quoted the BBC, and they wrote an article on how in Crete they have found a stone industry of stone tools going back to at least 130,000 years. And Crete has been an island in the middle of the Mediterranean for 5 million years. So they had to sail, and it was a continuous civilization, which means they were going back and forth. They knew how to navigate. So if they got to Crete 130,000 years ago, it's easy 70,000 years later that they could make it to the Americas at 56,000 years ago.
Right. That's really, now how did you even get back to this research? I mean, this is just, you know, did you start by reading They Came Before Columbus, and then you expanded on that research?
Yes. You see, that was 36 years ago, Dr. Van Sertima's book came out, and this information is piled on for 36 years. So many different things, so many cutting-edge articles and things have been found since then.
Yeah, and so, and what's the reaction you get when you talk about how Africans came here even before Native Americans?
People are amazed. They're shocked. They're shocked. First come shocks, and then they're smiling, and some frown, of course.
And then, you know, and what about the school systems? Because, you know, have we gotten this information to the educational system?
Not yet. The book has only been out for a month and a half.
And what kind of feedback are you getting, though, when you go around and talk about this? I mean, I'm assuming you're doing lectures around the country.
Yeah, well, I always bring my peer-reviewed articles.
Okay.
Because my thesis, which is the same as my title, The First Americans Were Africans, is backed up by 7, soon to be 8, peer-reviewed journal articles, which is the height of academia.
Wow. And so you've got credibility. I mean, people can see this research. What do you think? Do you think this is going to change history at all?
Well, for hundreds of years in Europe, people thought the world was flat, and it took a while for them to be able to say the world was round in order to go out there and navigate and see that it was indeed round. So it's going to take a little while for them to get around this, but it will happen.
Well, and tell us a little bit about these Africans who came before the Indians, before Columbus.
Okay, they came here, and they were first. Came to Tierra, excuse me, Pedra Fiorita, which is northeastern Brazil, and you'll see that that's the closest point from Africa to South America. And by canoe, a fellow, a navigator who was a doctor, wanted to prove that it could be done just in a canoe, and he set out in a canoe with a supply ship, but it did not touch him. He had a canoe with no oars, no paddle, no sail, nothing. He just sat there, and the currents took him straight from Africa to here. You've heard about people, if you throw a bottle in the water with a note, it'll come over. Yes, there are rivers in the ocean, currents, and it took him 52 days only. So you put a large sail on that vessel, and you get here in less than a month.
So it's definitely possible. We know that. It's physically possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so what part of Africa were the Africans from who came to Brazil?
Well, the DNA, the Genome Project has found that the earliest ones, the ones that they found in Tierra del Fuego, in the very tip of South America, in 1874, 1876, were the short Africans, the Khoisan, who spoke with clicks, like that. The Gods Must Be Crazy did a movie on that.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah.
Yes. So they have
about the Coca-Cola bottle that fell in, yeah.
Yes, they have the oldest DNA and the oldest language on the planet, and they were all over.
Oh, wow.
All over all three Americas, as well as Asia.
Well, have they done any DNA tests in Brazil to see that?
Yes, they have. The Genome Project went all around the world. There are 100,000 people participated.
Wow.
Taking DNA swabs.
And so first we know that it's possible to get over here by canoe, and second of all, the DNA from that group of Africans is in Brazil.
The most important thing, not to forget, to ask me, well, I will tell you that, where do the Native Americans come from? Well, we've always been taught that they came across the Bering Straits from Asia. This is true, but they did not come until 3000 BC. There is no evidence of them coming before 3000 BC. So for 53,000 years, there were nothing but Africans in North, Central, and South America.
Wow.
When they come over 3000 BC, those two groups, the Africans and the Mongolians, get together, the Asians, get together, and their children are the Native Americans.
Wow.
This is why the Native Americans do not look Chinese. They are a little different than Chinese.
Right. Oh, that's, you know what, I mean, we need to learn. It makes a lot of sense, Dr. Imhotep, and we need to learn our history.
Yes.
So I think it's fantastic that you've written this book, and I know people are wondering, how did they get the first Americans were Africans, documented evidence. I love this. And it's by Dr. David Imhotep. How do we get this book? I have a phone number.
Amazon.com.
Okay, Amazon.com.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's easy, Amazon.com. And Jeff is saying, give us that phone number, too, to order the book, and I have 540-772-1943.
That is correct.
Okay, so that's another phone number, 540-772-1943.
Because I do presentations for the book as well, 150 slide presentations, and that's for my people get me through my website, which is historictruth.info, historictruth.info. Okay, or they can just Google my name, David Imhotep.
And I was going to say, of course, we will link you to Dr. Imhotep through WLWT.com, because people, universities, schools can call you to come and speak. This is really important research, and we need to know more about this.
Thank you so much.
So I can't wait to finish reading the book. This is great. The First Americans Were Africans by Dr. David Imhotep. Thank you so much for coming. You have to come back.
Thank you.
All right, stick with us. We'll be back in a moment with some calendar events.
It's important to know, and I talked to David, Dr. David Imhotep, lately quite a bit. In fact, he's doing a second edition, and you notice, and this was an interview done about 10 years ago when his first edition came out, and at that point, he was only able to go back 53,000 years. Now, with his new edition, which added made several, at least 156 different additional footnotes and different research. We now know that we go back 100,000 years plus prior to the Asians coming through the Bering Strait. And that's what we were taught, that the Afro-Asians, and they were Afro-Asians that came through the Bering Strait. They weren't just Caucasians that did that, are white Indians, which is no such thing as a white Indian, except when they made one in 1830. In the 1830s, they made whites who were admixtured with Indians to be able to choose whether they want to be native or white. which is foolishness, and we'll be able to overcome that legally because of this research of Dr. Imhotep's and Dr. Clive Winters. So we have no problem at all with our indigenous argument. What we have a problem with is explaining this because of the huge amount of indoctrination that in our school textbooks that tell us differently than the evidence that we are now able to present to the various United Nations bodies as we push and move this piece through all the way through to an established nationhood and established recognition by all the states of the world, and including the United States, because we truly are indigenous people. And so nationalism, or Black nationalism, Afro-descendant nationalism, has taken a very sophisticated, prominent term, because we can now show that our strategy and our paradigm is much more superior than being a member of a Democratic Party and being a simple minority and getting a few crumbs, if any, that has now dwindled down to zero wealth. We are in extreme times. We ask you to consider all of these facts that we have presented to you today. And we will be back tomorrow, because I didn't have an opportunity to give a lot of advance notice. That's why we're going to redo this tomorrow. And this particular this particular video will be on YouTube, so you'll be able to replay it and re-record it. I don't like to keep you more than an hour. We're at the 57 minute point right now, but I do want to direct you to our website, www.adihr.us. That's ADIHR.us. That's the Afro Descendant Institute of Human Rights, or the African Descendant Nation, Afro Descendant IHR.us, which will have our upcoming webinars by our scholars, by our international lawyers, international experts, human rights experts. This is a really scientific, legal way to reconfigure our existence. We do not want to be defined. In fact, we are going to write a letter of opposition to America's census category, to have you redefine yourself with no information. So between now and the time that the census is going to be taken, we are going to inform you. We're going to discuss with you. We have books. The second edition of his book is coming out. We have two books that explain. One book is already out, and that's The Process. We urge you to get that, Civil Rights to Human Rights, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about moving from the civil rights category, this no-win category of being just a simple minority, to becoming a specially empowered minority with our own state and our own territory. The people called natives, who we created, have I think over 500 reserved areas in the United States. Some of them are extremely wealthy, some of them are not wealthy. But they don't have the type of technology that we have been fortunate to acquire, and expertise that we've been able to acquire. We just did not have the right political formula to be able to assert ourselves and to assert our equality in the Americas. So we're asking you to declare your citizenship in the Afro-descendant nation. The declaration is on our site. It also contains a request for decolonization, which would allow us to move this piece through the United Nations. We ask you to do this because it would not only save yourself, but save your family, because one of the statistics that has now been accelerated is that this is going to happen 20 years from now. And this has been happening. We've been shook out of the economy since 2003. It's being accelerated because of robotics and because of artificial intelligence. In the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be a dramatic change. There are not going to be any bus drivers. Buses are going to be controlled remotely. There are not going to be any Uber or Lyft drivers because those cars and they're already experimenting, and there already are some remote Lyft cars. So you're going to be picked up by a driverless car, at least it'll be drove remotely to your destination. The labor-intensive jobs that we now have in the unskilled positions are going to be severely and significantly reduced because of robotics and because of artificial intelligence. So the road to zero wealth has accelerated, and to the point that we have no choice but to do something that's intelligent, and that's to confederate and to nationalize, to protect our national resources and to protect ourselves and our families from going back into zero-sum slavery. Because if you don't have any money, you are a slave to the condition, or in any condition that you find yourself in as a poor person in a capitalistic society. So we thank you so much for coming in. We will be back here tomorrow because we had to get this information out to you quickly, because we have some big announcements coming up that's going to further give you confidence in us that this is the best way to now do politics of who gets what, so that we can have something for ourselves and for our families. So thank you so much. I'm going to leave you like I greeted you, in peace and power. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you. Tell your friends we'll be back here tomorrow at the same time, or to go to YouTube to my channel, Dr. Mustafa Ansari, the YouTube channel. It will be posted there in about 20-30 minutes after this, and this is probably the best of the two lectures, and I'm so glad that you came today. But the next one will be tomorrow at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you so much for attending again. I appreciate you. You have any questions, you can, the address is adselfdetermination@protonmail.com. Please don't hesitate. I thank you so very much.